In September 1962, President John Kennedy toured the McDonnell aircraft plant in St. Louis as the country's space program was moving from the single astronaut Mercury capsules to the two-person Gemini program. Kennedy had set the bold goal, put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and St. Louis was building the capsules taking the first Americans into space.
We kind of had a saying that it was the Model T of the space world.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit.
The goal of the moon landing would be reached July 20th, 1969, 50 years ago. And the role of this city and its engineers and technicians would play no small part in getting us there. St. Louis had been in love with flight since the days of the World's Fair. It wasn't just balloons, but balloons that could be controlled and steered over a set course. Scott Field became an airship base after World War I, but even by then, it was clearly the age of the airplane. Small airlines were operating out of Lambert Field, and manufacturers were building planes in St. Louis. Local businessmen and aviation enthusiasts backed airmail pilot Charles Lindbergh's bold plan to fly solo across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. It was local money that put the city's name on his plane. Lindbergh completed the flight in 1927 in the spirit of St. Louis. But it was World War II that brought defense contracts to airplane builders, including a small startup run by James McDonnell, which got contracts for parts. But it was after the war and into the Cold War era that McDonnell Aircraft grew as a builder of jet planes for the military. And then something happened in 1957 that shocked the country. The Soviet Union announced that one of its rockets had successfully put the first satellite into orbit. It wasn't just about a satellite, it was about the rockets. Rockets powerful enough to reach space or to deliver a nuclear warhead halfway around the world. The late John Yardley, a McDonnell executive who would play a key role in the space race, talked with us at McDonnell Douglas headquarters in 1995 and said he was not as surprised about Sputnik as the general public.
It didn't impress me as much as it impressed the world. And I said, well, you know, we're going to do that next January. We had not McDonnell Douglas, but the International Geophysical Year was going on. And the United States had the charge to try an artificial satellite. And the Navy was doing it. And it was called Vanguard. And when the Russians sent it off, well, what's the big deal? We're going to do it next. Well, the big deal was that Vanguard went clunk.
There were a number of failures during the year, and the United States promptly announced them. The first and most spectacular of these was Vanguard at the end of 1957. There were other Vanguard failures. All achieved takeoff, but trouble occurred either in the second or third stages. Explorers 2 and 5, Beacon, and Pioneer 2 were also considered unsuccessful experiments.
This thing sort of catapulted the Russians into that leadership, and nobody liked it. And everybody thought it was worth money to put our technical capability into doing this. And it was a month or so before our top management reacted and it's got a feel for what might happen and what they ought to do, and that's when I got transferred.
So that changed what you were doing?
Yes, yes. Space as a business was not thought to be coming for a long time. When the Russians orbited the Sputnik and everybody got excited about it, and there were all sorts of recriminations of how come we let them get ahead of us and let's get going on this thing. We all jumped on the bandwagon because we really believed we should get ahead of the Russians. A, and B, it was potential business.
In the late 1950s, McDonnell Aircraft found itself in a new business.
manufacturing this country's first space capsules.
Mercury's primary purpose was to establish that you could fly men successfully in space. Gemini's task was to fly 2 men at a time and to test things like extravehicular activity, rendezvous, docking, and things of that nature. Now, it was imperative to get this done quickly in order to get to the moon this decade, which President Kennedy had made a target. And as such, we couldn't use a whole lot of new technology unless it were almost ready. So we did the job with what we could. Mercury had, I'd say, absolutely no advanced technology. Gemini did have a phased-in flight computer and fuel cells and other things of a higher technology because they had more time.
Years later, after successful visits to the moon and during the era of the space shuttle, we were invited to a reunion in St. Anne, a reunion of the men and women whose names we don't know, but who were responsible for the lives of the first American astronauts. Everybody knew the first American astronauts, the Mercury 7 they called them: Shepard, Grissom, Glenn, Schirra, Slayton, Carpenter, Cooper. But thousands of other people were involved in this.
Okay, John.
When an astronaut climbed into the Mercury capsule, he was climbing into a craft built in St. Louis by workers at McDonnell Aircraft. And the last people the astronauts saw before blastoff were McDonnell employees who bolted on the hatch. That's you here, right?
Yeah, this is me here with my back. Hair was a little darker.
Cal Mosher came up from Texas for this reunion. He had worked with the space capsules after they arrived at Cape Canaveral to prepare them for the space shots.
We're just doing some modification and putting some brackets on for some wiring. And this was before John Glenn's flight.
McDonnell Aircraft signed the contract to build America's first space capsules for manned flight in 1959. And some here were part of it from the very beginning. What were you doing when you got called into this project?
I was working on F-101, and it phased out in 1958. And after that phased out, they said, you're going to get transferred over to a new program.
Originally, they took us all off the airplane line. They sort of skimmed off the best, started astronautics, and then we all worked from there.
What were your thoughts at the time?
I didn't think it'd work.
McDonnell built jet planes, but space capsules had to withstand greater stresses: the blastoff, the vacuum of space, the intense heat of re-entry, and the splashdown in the ocean. McDonnell's contract was for 20 capsules. Only 7 were planned for manned flights. The others would be used for various tests, including flights with chimps on board. The capsules were small, just 9 feet high, 6 feet in diameter at the base. Just enough room for a single astronaut who could do little more than move his head and arms. It made it a challenge for those who built these capsules. As work progressed and the capsule filled with equipment and controls, only one worker at a time could get inside, with progressively less room to maneuver. It was demanding work. We were trying to catch up to the Soviet Union in the space race, and they would put the first man into orbit around the Earth.
We were always rushed, always pressed, long hours, good crew, and everything was being done for the first time.
You got to remember now, back there, everything was slide rule and pencil.
And then came testing, more testing than had ever before been given a manned vehicle. The first manned spacecraft was delivered in December 1960, only 23 months after the company had received the contract. Now
those involved remembered the demanding deadlines and the long hours, but they also remembered the teamwork, the dedication, the problem solving. They were pioneers. No one had been here before. No one could tell them how to do it. And I imagine every space program built on what you guys did.
Yes, we kind of had a saying that it was the Model T of the space war.
And back then you didn't have all the red tape that you had to go through 15,000 signatures to get something done. And we did it, you know, it was all just done like that. Well, you can later on in the programs you couldn't do like that because it got too involved.
It was February 20th, 1962, that John H. Glenn entered his spacecraft.
Something else they couldn't do after those first few space flights was hide souvenirs inside the space capsule. Not after they got caught. The ground crew would stash dollar bills before blastoff. They'd be signed by crew members and astronauts and framed, verified as having orbited the Earth.
Signed by John Glenn.
Yeah.
NASA officials were none too happy when they found out.
Yeah, right. It was a scandal. Remember that? The guys coming down and investigating the dollar bills and the $2 bills?
I wasn't in on it.
Don't you lie to me. You were in on it. He is the one, Joe is the one that logged all of these
That's
$2
Joe
bills.
Trammell on the right. He hosted this reunion. His memories of those important and exciting times are slipping away. He's in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and he wanted to see his old friends while he still remembered them. His wife, Ruth, made all the arrangements.
Go ahead.
I really appreciate you people coming out for this and being with us. The best group in the world. I love all of you. God bless you.
We love you, Joe.
One minute, bud.
It's been a long time since the first days of the space program. They remember the good things now and mostly laugh at the bad. They're proud of what they did and proud of how well they did it.
I had so much faith that we built it, it was going to work. And that's what I went on. You know, we just, instead of saying, oh boy, I worry about this and worry about that, we knew when it was ready to launch that the spacecraft was ready to go because everybody had done their job.
And I know that the way it was put together and the way the mission worked out, there was more went into it than just a wage that you were earning here in the plant. Your hearts went into it as ours did down at the Cape, too.
John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth and later a U.S. Senator, was invited to the reunion but sent his regrets. In a handwritten note to Joe Trammell, he wrote, "They were great days none of us will ever forget. It was a great team we were all part of, and we did a good job for this country."
And I can imagine no action, no adventure, which is more essential and more exciting than to be involved in the most important and significant adventure that any man has been able to participate in the history of the world. And it's going to take place in this decade. And I congratulate you on what you have done, and I congratulate you on being part of this adventure. Thank you.
I'm just thankful I was part of it now, even though I was kind of apprehensive when I first started. But now, the best thing that's ever happened to me in my life.
Joe was the catalyst that brought us all back together. A lot of us have died. We have members that are 91 that just couldn't make it. And most of us have one illness or another, but it put us back together probably for the last time.
The real contest that was envisioned, correctly or not, was a race for supremacy in the hearts and minds of the world for technical leadership. And that's what the United States couldn't bear. You know, everybody was saying, they saw the Russians do it, they looked over the U.S. and, what are you guys doing? So I think that's really what happened.
After the Russians put Sputnik into orbit in 1957, McDonnell Aircraft put Yardley in charge of the design and construction of the spacecraft for the Mercury and Gemini flights. These were the stepping stones to the moon. Yardley would later be involved in developing the space shuttle. John Glenn called him one of the real pioneers of the space program. And in 1995, Yardley had this assessment of what was called the space race.
And where it's going from where we are today, I don't know, but I think it's been good for the country to do what we have done. The Apollo landing was clearly a worldwide event, telecast all over the world, and the reaction was really staggering. There was no question then who was in the leadership. The Russians quit their program, you know.
Certainly, I guess the space race was as much a technological race as it was a public relations race.
Yeah, but I think nobody would have done it for the technological parts if it hadn't been for the political parts.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit.
50 years ago this July, Americans got to the moon first, that is, before the Russians. That's what counted. It had been a race. They had put the first man in orbit. A few years before that, they had launched the first satellite, Sputnik. And while it is often described as a jolt, a shock to America, McDonnell engineer John Yardley, who would be a key figure in the space program, said in 1995 that it actually took a while for Sputnik to sink in, for America to shift gears.
Well, it seems very sharp in retrospect. Now, in case of actual fact, I'd say it took 6 months to really coagulate the thinking, and that the politicians know what they wanted to do, and the fight start in the Congress and all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't daily. I mean, a lot of people read that, who cares? But once they started reading the editorial pages and looking at the television, said, you know, we're getting the reputation of second-class citizens in technology, which Americans don't want.
As a builder of jet planes, McDonnell Douglas was ready to bid on and win the contract for the first space capsules. Its role in the early days of the space race came at a time when St. Louis was redefining itself with the modern centerpiece of its new image, the Gateway Arch, going up on the riverfront. President Johnson visited St. Louis to mark its 200th anniversary in 1964.
You faced a hard choice, and you made it. The people of St. Louis chose progress, not decay. A new spirit of St. Louis was born, and today you look to the future with new pride and with new confidence.
There was more to St. Louis's image as a city on the move than its new riverfront monument. St. Louis now had a big part in the great adventure of the 1960s, and it was helping the country to catch up to the Soviet Union in the space race. McDonnell Aircraft had won the contract in 1959 to build the Mercury capsules that carried the first Americans into space. And President John F. Kennedy had set the goal of reaching the moon by the end of the decade. The president himself came to the plant in 1962 as the space program entered the next phase, the two-man voyages of the Gemini capsules.
And I can imagine no action, no adventure, which is more essential and more exciting than to be involved in the most important and significant adventure that any man has been able to participate in the history of the world. And it's going to take place in this decade. And I congratulate you on what you have done, and I congratulate you on being part of this adventure. Thank you.
Kennedy was given a tour of the plant by James McDonnell, who had started his company in 1939 with just one employee. It had built aircraft for World War II, Korea, the Cold War, and now for space travel.
We were sticking our necks out. This was flying men in a hostile environment that nobody knew much about, and we never lost a man. And that isn't true for other contractors who've been in this business.
There would be tragic deaths in the coming years. 3 killed in an Apollo capsule fire during a test in 1967. Later, the Challenger space shuttle disaster in '86, and the Columbia in 2003. But the space race has always been about technology and risk, and it came with achievement and adventure and inspiration. Paul Shankman went to meet a man who early on got attached to this story and never let go.
How is the quality of the TV? Oh, it's beautiful.
For hundreds of years, Bonne Terre, Missouri has been all about what used to go on here underground. But these days, people here are thinking more about what's overhead, thanks to a longtime resident who believes the sky is truly the limit.
I don't have a problem with a whole lot of people, but I have a problem with people who talk a lot and do nothing.
Earl Mullins is not just a talker.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
He had a dream to build a space museum in Bonne Terre. So in 2003, Earl took over the building that had once been the city's water department and flooded it with items from his personal collection of space memorabilia. But launching the museum was a challenge.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Like Apollo 13, Earl's Space Museum seemed destined to be a successful failure.
Went 1.5 years and nobody stepped through the door. Not one.
But Earl never gave up, and today the Space Museum is on a much better trajectory.
We've been at this for 18 years. It's just now beginning to blossom.
That balloon will soon be hurtling across the sky 1,000 miles high over North America.
Earl's fascination with space began in the early 1960s, when he was just a kid, intrigued by an early experiment in satellite communication called Project Echo.
You can fire up the transmitter.
Right.
I spent a lot of time in the front yard looking up in the sky, and I saw this thing. It was Echo, and I was had.
From then on, Earl began collecting anything he could find related to space, whether based on fact or fantasy, starting with this Project Mercury pencil sharpener he won at a carnival. The first pieces to go on display here came from Earl's personal collection. There are real cosmonaut gloves and so-called satellite shoes. Even the soap dispenser in the restroom is out of this world.
One reason that I went into the Space Museum business so I could get my hands on more stuff.
And he has. Earl estimates his personal collection today is worth at least $500,000, but that's only the beginning.
We are in possession. It's going on $23 million worth of NASA stuff.
Even before it opened, it was clear the one thing the Space Museum lacked was space. So in 2014, work began on a new addition, built by some of the same men who helped build the space program itself.
Project Mercury had officially begun.
St. Louis-based McDonnell Douglas played a critical role in the space race, and it was a team of retired Mac engineers, all in their 80s, who came to Bonne Terre every weekend for almost 4 years to work with other volunteers and donors to create an annex in an adjacent building named in memory of Gus Grissom, one of the Mercury 7 astronauts who later died in a fire aboard Apollo 1.
We're really not done, Paul. We're adding artifacts nearly every 2 or 3 months as NASA makes them available. It is a space shuttle main gear tire. There were 4 of these and then 2 smaller tires on the nose. That's a piece of heat shield off of Apollo 8 lunar rover fenders. That's actually the keys to the space shuttle.
There is also a piece of Skylab that fell to the Earth in Australia, and a separated Saturn V engine inlet found in the ocean that possibly came from Apollo 11.
You know, Paul, most people think that the white on the shuttle is paint, and it really is not. There's a coating on there, and this is it. It's a ceramic fiber or blanket. If you were to look at the shuttle up close, it would look like a patchwork quilt.
But the museum's most prized flown item is this small flag, taken into space by Gene Cernan, the last American to walk on the moon.
It either stayed in the spacecraft that orbited the moon, or it went with him, and it could have literally been on the surface of the moon.
Don't tell me, let me guess. This is the space toilet.
It is the space toilet, and frankly, it's one of the most often asked questions, how to use the bathroom in space. The water is extracted, recirculated, and you use it again.
For the toilet?
No.
For?
Yes.
At one time, there had been talk about moving the museum to St. Louis, and for a brief time, part of it did move to Branson.
Unfortunately, we were a small fish in a big pond down there. Up here, we kind of like to think of ourselves as a big fish in a small pond, so we'll see. Basically, the reaction we get is, in Bonne Terre, really?
To which Earl responds, why not? After all, Bonne Terre is French for good earth, and it was also where swing-away can openers were made, the brand used aboard the first U.S. space station.
We really like to think that we're about more than the artifacts. We're about a way of thinking. We're about dreaming big, pushing the boundaries, uncovering problems, and then solving those problems. It's a Michelin, for crying out loud.
For Earl, the goal has always been to turn visitors into enthusiasts, like Debbie House, a retired nurse who came to the museum looking for work as a volunteer. Today, she is the administrative assistant.
The very first thing he talked to me after, you go through the regular who you are and what you've done, and he'll say, do you know when we landed on the moon? And I said, no. He said, then obviously you don't know who landed on the moon. And I said, no. He said, do you care? I said, nope. But I'm going to tell you something. I have fallen in love with this. This is my passion. I want to know more. I try every day to learn more.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
There is an illustration on the wall here, which includes a quote from astronaut John Glenn that seems an apt description of what the Space Museum is all about. He said, it may be that those who dream the most do the most. Or put another way, creating the Space Museum was one small step for mankind, thanks to one giant leap by a man.
It's about doing noble things. It's about reaching out of your comfort zone, thinking about things more than just yourself, and doing something for humanity. And leave a legacy. Leave more than you take.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
There's a generation of Americans who grew up with the space race, but moon landings, they are to today's young people what Lindbergh's flight was to baby boomers. And after all, people have been living in space in shifts for going on 20 years now on the International Space Station. When it comes to space exploration, we are today looking beyond the moon to the planets, and there's a new generation of explorers and engineers, including a St. Louis native who is helping us get there. Her name is Brooke Harper, and if you don't recognize the name or the face, you might remember her from this video.
Touchdown confirmed.
When the InSight spacecraft landed on Mars November 26th of last year, the aerospace engineer who grew up in Chesterfield, went to Parkway Central with engineering degrees from Mizzou and Georgia Tech, celebrated with her colleague, and became an internet sensation.
It's all a blur to me now, to be honest. It was just such a high and an emotion that I've never felt in my life. It was just surreal is the word that I keep using. As a systems engineer, you live in paranoia until a spacecraft is safely on the ground.
Yeah, those of us who are following this, we sort of assume it will work, but if you think back, there have been projects that have literally crashed and burned or disappeared or lost contact with.
Correct, yeah, there was about a 40% success rate at Mars, so, less than half.
There were a lot of people, of course, who made it happen, the people who designed and built InSight. The team in charge of the launch and the separation to begin the long journey to Mars. That worked, and they celebrated.
A lot of excited people.
InSight would travel for 6 months, and it didn't have to just get to Mars. It had to enter the atmosphere at just the right angle. Too shallow, and it bounces off into space. Too steep, and it burns up. They got the angle right, and that's when the EDL begins: entry, descent, and landing. Brooke Harper's on that team, and so we asked her to give the play-by-play of the animated version.
Right now, our aeroshell, which is the upside-down ice cream cone looking thing, is going to separate from the cruise stage, which is what just happened right there. That cruise stage had solar arrays on it. It was providing us power and everything during the about 6.5-month cruise. At this point, we are reaching the Martian atmosphere, and what you're seeing is our heat shield, which is glorified fancy cork, get hot, and it really insulates the spacecraft.
Is this where you start worrying about whether all this stuff's going to survive?
This is it. This is entry right now. There's always a chance that one of those things that needs to happen at the exact right time doesn't. And unfortunately, in the case of entry, descent, and landing, you need all those things to happen correctly, or your mission is done.
Nobody's driving this thing anymore, right?
Correct.
It's
this
driving
is all
itself. This is all of the programming is driving
It's
it.
all on its own.
So there's no joysticks, there's no instructions, there's no do this, do that.
And in fact, it takes around 8 minutes for a command to be sent to the spacecraft, and all of EDL takes between 5.5 to 7.5 minutes, depending on atmosphere and mass.
In the business, they just call it 7 minutes of terror. So
And
by
a
the
bunch of
time
other
something
things.
went wrong, you wouldn't find out about
Exactly.
it until it was...
Exactly. So
She's 29 years old, and being a woman in the space program isn't all that unusual anymore. She says the EDL team was about 50-50 men and women, but she also knows that video has made her something of a role model for girls who are interested in science and engineering. So what's your story? What kind of kid were you? How did you get into this field? Is it something you were early on interested in, or that you picked it up later?
I knew I wanted to do something in the space industry. As a kid, I was always looking up at the stars. It was always something that I was interested in. And I decided to go to graduate school, and that was where I really wanted to emphasize in something. And I researched entry, descent, and landing, and Georgia Tech actually had a great program that was very entry, descent, and landing focused, and I fortunately was accepted into that program. Yeah, I really didn't know anything about it until 2012, and you know, here I am now, 2018, 6 years later, having just accomplished my first flight project, which was a mission to Mars with entry, descent, and landing. So it's all been a dream that, yeah, if I look at everything in hindsight of my life, it's pretty crazy.
One of her jobs as part of the EDL team was to think up worst-case scenarios, throw monkey wrenches into the plans, come up with things that could go wrong, and then figure out how InSight would have to respond.
And hopefully it would respond in a manner that we could survive. We go through what we call the hypersonic phase and eventually deploy the parachute, which is what just happened at about 11 kilometers from the ground. After we deploy the chute, we deployed our heat shield and our landing legs, which is what just happened. For us as a team, we were very optimistic, but of course there are those what we call unknown unknowns. Mars may throw us a bad weather day, and our density prediction may be completely off from what we had estimated, and you know that could influence the flight a lot. And you know, our radar couldn't work, or maybe one of our pyros don't actually fire, and we never separate from the cruise stage, or we never deploy the chute, or the chute explodes. I mean, all these things can happen.
And do happen. In 2016, the European Space Agency had a very similar landing plan for the Schiaparelli spacecraft, and one of the many things that could go wrong did. It entered the atmosphere, and they waited for word of touchdown, and waited, and never heard from it again. A photo taken by a satellite later showed the crash site. Data indicated that when the parachute opened, the craft started spinning faster than its indicators could measure. Then the radar misread the altitude. The chute was released too early. The engines fired, but only for a few seconds, and it plunged to the Martian surface. 2 years later, NASA's InSight was beginning its own entry and descent.
Telemetry shows the spacecraft saw about 8 Gs.
In the room, I mean, you can cut everything with a knife. It's just, everyone is so tense. It's high anxiety, high stress. We're all exhausted from operations, and obviously the amount of work that you've poured over years to make this a reality and a success. And so
but she and her colleague and fellow football fan Gene Bonfiglio were confident enough that 6 weeks before InSight's arrival at Mars, they started planning how they would celebrate success, at least in part to break the tension.
We found a video of a touchdown celebration that we thought as engineers we could actually try and do. When we touched down on Mars, we were ready to go through this handshake.
Touchdown confirmed.
It was not planned that we would actually be the front and center shot on the camera feed, but we were, and that's what a lot of publications and media picked up on. So it's been very positive reactions to it, and we're just happy to help expose people and engage people in what the InSight mission is all about. So it's been really a great experience for both him and I.
InSight is now doing its work, not just taking pictures. That's been done already. It's looking deep into the planet. NASA says to take its vital signs, heat, seismology, studying the interior of Mars, its geologic history. The EDL team is no longer involved in that, but they are taking a close look at all the data that was sent back. And so far, it looks pretty good. But you're hooked on it now.
Yeah. It's fun. It's a lot of work, but it's, like I said, that feeling of accomplishment and success is something that I want to feel again, and I feel like doing another mission is really what's going to provide me that.
So my final question is, have you thought about going to Mars yourself?
I have. I don't think I'm going to be one of those that will volunteer for one of the first or second or even probably 100th mission. I would wait until things are, it's a flight from here to Kansas City is what I'll wait for. But I know that there are a lot of people that are eager to volunteer for that first mission to Mars, and not myself. I think it's very cool. I would maybe do a trip around Earth or go to the moon someday, but I'm not sure Mars is in my future for myself.
But you wouldn't mind helping them get there?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That would be a dream if I were somehow on the mission that would take the first humans to Mars. That would be incredible. Much more terrifying, because now, money is one thing, but you've got human life. That's, something that you absolutely have to protect and be confident that your system is going to work.
Yeah, you need a better than 40% chance of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So that would be incredible.
July 20th of 1969, 50 years ago, we landed on the moon. And on a leg of the lunar lander was a plaque. It's still there. And it was read by Neil Armstrong, with Edwin Aldrin standing alongside.
Dear men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. It came in peace.
It seems so low-tech by today's standards, not just the quality of the video, but even perhaps the need for humans to even be there. So much space exploration today is carried out remotely, efficiently, and safely by robots roaming Mars. The New Horizons spacecraft sending back high-definition photos as it speeds past Pluto of all places. The European Space Agency's Rosetta mission landed a probe on a comet, and an array of earthbound telescopes recorded the first image of a black hole. But for many, if space exploration is going to be a real adventure, real people are going to have to be involved. But those astronauts knew better than most of the rest of us that it was the hundreds, the thousands of people, like those at McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis in the 1960s, that had gotten them there and then safely brought them home.